Mary Virginia Jones spent nearly half of her life inside prison walls for a crime she did not commit, and her story stands today as one of the clearest examples of how fear, coercion, and domestic violence can be erased by a justice system that prefers simple villains to complex truths. In 1982, when a Los Angeles courtroom sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Mary was not seen as a frightened woman trapped by an abusive partner. She was labeled an accomplice, a silent participant, a woman whose presence behind the wheel of a car was enough to condemn her forever. The court did not see the years of violence that had already shaped her life, nor did it hear the unspoken reality of that night in 1981 when her choices were reduced to obedience or death. By the time the gavel fell, Mary's life as a free person had effectively ended, even though she had never pulled a trigger, never planned a crime, and never wanted anyone harmed. The events that destroyed Mary's life unfolded in 1981, during a relationship that was already defined by terror. She was involved with Mose Willis, a man known for his volatility, cruelty, and complete disregard for human life. To the outside world, Mary may have appeared quiet and compliant, but inside that relationship, she lived in a constant state of fear. Willis was not just emotionally abusive. He was physically violent and openly threatening. He controlled Mary through intimidation, isolation, and the ever-present possibility of lethal force. Like many victims of long-term domestic abuse, Mary learned that survival often meant silence and obedience. Resistance only escalated the violence. This psychological conditioning would later become the most misunderstood aspect of her case. On the night that changed everything, Willis forced Mary into a car at gunpoint and ordered her to drive. There was no discussion, no agreement, no plan shared with her. The weapon made the situation clear. Disobedience was not an option. As Mary drove, terrified and hyper-aware of every movement, Willis abducted a 23-year-old man. Mary witnessed the crime unfold, powerless to intervene. She watched as Willis took that young man's life, committing murder in front of her eyes. For Mary, the trauma was immediate and overwhelming. She was not a participant, she was a hostage. But fear has no visible bruises, and trauma leaves no fingerprints. When the night ended, Mary was alive, but psychologically shattered, carrying the unbearable weight of something she never chose. When the case reached court in 1982, the narrative was brutally simple. Mary had driven the car. Mary had been present. Therefore, Mary was guilty. The prosecution framed her as an accomplice who willingly aided a murderer. The jury was never given the full picture. Critical evidence about Willis's long history of abuse, his threats, and the power he held over Mary was never properly presented. Her defense failed to explain coercion in a way the court could understand. And at that time, the legal system had little patience for the idea that prolonged domestic violence could override free will. The concept of battered woman syndrome existed only on the fringes of legal thought and was often dismissed as an excuse rather than a reality. The trial moved quickly and with devastating consequences. Jurors deliberated without understanding that Mary's silence was not consent, and her presence was not participation. They were not told how abusers systematically stripped their victims of autonomy, nor how fear can paralyze even the strongest instincts for self-preservation. The verdict reflected the limits of the era's legal mindset. Mary Virginia Jones was sentenced to life in prison without parole, the same fate reserved for the most calculating killers. She was led away not as a survivor of violence, but as a woman the system decided was expendable. Prison could have destroyed what little remained of Mary's spirit, but instead, something unexpected happened. Over the years, she became a source of calm and guidance for other incarcerated women. She listened to their stories, shared hard-earned wisdom, and offered empathy in a place defined by despair. Slowly, she became known as Mama Mary, a maternal figure who nurtured hope where none was supposed to exist. She never stopped insisting on her innocence, but she did so quietly, without bitterness. Her dignity became her resistance. Guards noticed it. Other inmates depended on it. Even as the years passed and her hair turned gray, Mary carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who knew the truth would eventually matter. Outside the prison walls, however, time moved differently. Laws evolved. Society began to confront the realities of domestic violence more seriously. Legal scholars and advocates started to acknowledge that coercion could fundamentally alter a person's ability to act freely. Decades after Mary's conviction, these changes would finally reach her case. The turning point came when the Post-Conviction Justice Project at the University of Southern California began reviewing her file. Law students and attorneys saw what the original court had ignored: a woman sentenced to die in prison for surviving an encounter with a violent abuser. The team meticulously re-examined the evidence, uncovering details that had been buried or dismissed. They documented Willis's abusive behavior, the threats he made, and the clear power imbalance in the relationship. They argued that Mary's actions were not criminal choices, but forced responses under immediate threat of death. By 2014, California law had changed enough to recognize these realities. New statutes acknowledged the impact of intimate partner violence on criminal responsibility, allowing courts to reconsider cases like Mary's with a more informed lens. When Mary's case returned to court, it carried the weight of 32 lost years. This time, the narrative was different. The court finally listened. Judges acknowledged that Mary had been operating under extreme duress and that her original trial had failed to provide a fair assessment of her circumstances. The truth, long ignored, was spoken plainly. Mary Virginia Jones was not a criminal accomplice. She was a survivor, trapped in a situation no reasonable person could escape. On November 17, 2014, Mary walked out of prison at the age of 74. She wore a white jacket and carried herself with quiet composure, but the moment was overwhelming. For the first time in more than 3 decades, she breathed free air without permission. She was no longer an inmate number or a cautionary tale buried in court records. She was a woman reclaiming a life that had been unjustly taken from her. The world she stepped into was unfamiliar, shaped by decades she never lived, but her resilience remained intact. Mary's release did more than correct a single injustice. It forced a broader reckoning within the legal community. Her case is now studied in law schools as a defining example of how coercion and domestic abuse must be understood in criminal proceedings. It demonstrates how easily the justice system can fail when it ignores psychological reality in favor of rigid legal formulas. Mary's story is not just about wrongful conviction. It is about the cost of silence, the danger of oversimplification, and the human lives lost when courts refuse to see victims as complex individuals. Even now, Mary Virginia Jones's name carries a quiet power. It reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied only to the victim, but to society as a whole. For 32 years, the system insisted it was right. In the end, it had to admit it was wrong. Mary survived abuse, imprisonment, and erasure, and walked free with her dignity intact. Her life stands as proof that truth can endure even when buried beneath decades of fear, steel bars, and institutional failure.